They say revenge is a dish best served cold, but I never imagined how bitter it would taste when it finally reached my lips. My name doesn't matter anymore. What matters is what I discovered, what I did with that knowledge, and how it destroyed everything I thought I wanted to save. This is the story of how I found out my daughter-in-law was selling intimate photos online, and how I weaponized that secret to win a war I should never have started. If you're settling in for this tale of family destruction and calculated vengeance, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. You're about to hear something that will shake you to your core, and I need you to stay with me until the very end. I was 53 when my world collapsed, though the cracks had been showing for years. Picture a woman who had spent 3 decades perfecting the art of invisible suffering. That was me. I lived in a colonial house with white columns and a perfectly manicured lawn, married to a man who treated our marriage like a business merger that had failed to generate expected returns. Richard was the kind of husband who remembered anniversaries only when his secretary reminded him, who spoke to me in boardroom directives and treated affection like a limited resource he couldn't afford to waste. Our daughter Emma was 25 then, fresh out of law school with her father's sharp mind and, I thought, my capacity for loyalty. How wrong I was. She had Richard's eyes, cold blue, calculating, and his ability to compartmentalize emotions when they became inconvenient. I had raised her to be strong, independent, everything I had never been allowed to be. I had sacrificed my own dreams of becoming an interior designer, channeling that creativity instead into making our house a showpiece. Our family a picture of suburban success. The marriage had been dying slowly for years, like a plant that gets just enough water to survive but never enough to thrive. Richard's pharmaceutical consulting firm was thriving, bringing in more money than we could spend. But somewhere along the way we had stopped being a family and become co-investors in a lifestyle neither of us particularly enjoyed. We entertained clients in our dining room with the crystal chandelier, hosted charity galas in our backyard, smiled for photos that would appear in the local society pages. But behind closed doors, we were strangers sharing a mortgage and a daughter who had grown up watching us perform love rather than live it. I threw myself into volunteer work, chairing committees for the hospital auxiliary, organizing fundraisers for the children's literacy program, anything to fill the hollow spaces in my days. I was good at it, organizing, motivating people, creating beautiful events that raised money for worthy causes. But I was essentially playing house on a grander scale, arranging other people's lives while my own remained carefully curated but fundamentally empty. Emma brought David home during her final year of law school. He was everything Richard wasn't: warm, attentive, genuinely interested in conversation. He asked about my volunteer work, complimented the meals I cooked, noticed when I changed my hair. David worked in digital marketing for a tech startup, one of those companies with exposed brick walls and employees who wore sneakers to work. He was ambitious but in a modern way, talking about building something meaningful rather than just accumulating wealth. I liked him immediately, which should have been my first warning. When someone fits too perfectly into the shape of what you've been missing, you need to ask yourself what they're really after. But I was so hungry for warmth, for genuine connection, that I welcomed him into our family like a space heater in a cold house. Richard approved of David's earning potential and his obvious devotion to Emma. The wedding planning became my obsession. A year-long project that finally gave me something beautiful to create. The wedding was everything I had dreamed of: 200 guests, a string quartet, Emma radiant in a dress that cost more than most people's cars. I planned every detail, from the ivory peonies to the champagne fountain, turning our backyard into something from a fairy tale. For one perfect day, we looked like the family I had always pretended we were. Richard made a toast about new beginnings. Emma thanked me for giving her the wedding of her dreams. David promised to love and protect our daughter forever. 6 months later, Richard's firm was under federal investigation for off-label drug promotion. The pharmaceutical industry was cracking down on consultants who had been too creative in their marketing strategies. And Richard's name appeared on documents that suggested he had crossed lines that should never have been crossed. The legal fees alone drained our savings within months. Richard withdrew emotionally even further, spending 18-hour days with lawyers, barely speaking to me except to bark orders about selling assets or cutting expenses. The house went first, our beautiful colonial with its perfect gardens and entertaining spaces. We moved to a cramped apartment across town, and I watched Richard's pride crumble along with our financial security. But the worst part wasn't the money. It was watching Emma choose sides without hesitation. When the scandal broke, when Richard's reputation was splattered across the business pages, Emma distanced herself from us like we were carrying a contagious disease. She stopped returning my calls. When I did reach her, our conversations were brief, professional, like she was speaking to a client she didn't particularly like. She and David bought a house, a beautiful Victorian downtown with original hardwood floors and stained glass windows, while Richard and I were selling furniture to pay legal bills. Emma's law firm was doing well, and David's startup had been acquired by a larger company. Their lives were ascending while ours crashed into the ground. I tried to maintain dignity during those early months of our fall. I continued my volunteer work, though the other women on the committees began treating me differently, with a mixture of pity and wariness, as if financial scandal might be contagious. I smiled and pretended everything was fine, that this was just a temporary setback, that Richard would clear his name and we would rebuild. But inside, I was dying a little more each day. The worst moment came at Christmas. Emma hosted dinner for the first time, in her new house with its perfect crown molding and gleaming kitchen. She seated Richard and me at one end of the table while David's parents, a retired teacher and a small business owner, got the seats of honor near Emma. During dinner, David's mother asked about our situation, and I watched Emma's face freeze with embarrassment. She changed the subject quickly, but I caught the look she exchanged with David. It was a look that said, "Please don't ask about them." After dinner, I followed Emma into the kitchen while she was loading the dishwasher. I tried to talk to her about how difficult things had been, how much we missed seeing her, how proud we were of the life she was building. She listened with the patience of someone enduring an unwelcome sales pitch. When I finished, she said, "Mom, I think it's better if we keep some distance while Dad sorts out his legal issues. David and I are building our careers, and we can't afford to have this affect our professional reputations." I stood there holding a stack of plates, looking at my daughter, the child I had raised, the woman I had given everything to create, and realized she was cutting us out of her life like a cancerous growth. "Emma," I said, "I'm your mother. This is your family. We stick together through hard times." She looked at me with Richard's cold eyes and said, "Family is a luxury I can't afford right now." Then she took the plates from my hands and continued loading the dishwasher as if I wasn't there. That night, lying in our cramped apartment bedroom while Richard snored beside me, I felt something break inside my chest. Not my heart, that had been breaking slowly for years. This was something deeper, something that had kept me tethered to the idea that love and loyalty and family meant something. Emma's rejection wasn't just personal. It was existential. If my own daughter could discard me so easily, what had any of it meant? All those years of sacrifice, of putting her needs first, of building my identity around being her mother, what had it been for? The legal proceedings dragged on for 18 months. Richard was eventually cleared of criminal charges but faced massive civil penalties that destroyed what remained of our assets. By the time it was over, we were essentially starting from zero at 55, too old to rebuild careers, too proud to ask for help from friends who had quietly distanced themselves during our troubles. Richard found work as a consultant for a small firm, making a fraction of his former income. I took a job at a home goods store, using my design background to help customers choose throw pillows and window treatments. Meanwhile, Emma's star continued to rise. She made partner at her firm 2 years early. David's new position came with stock options that made them genuinely wealthy. They bought a vacation house in the mountains. Their Christmas cards showed them skiing in Aspen, sailing in the Caribbean, living the kind of life I had once taken for granted. They never called, never visited, never acknowledged that Richard and I existed except for obligatory birthday cards signed with just their names. I became obsessed with their social media presence. Emma posted constantly photos of elaborate dinners she cooked, weekends at wine country bed and breakfasts, her home office with its built-in bookshelves and original artwork. David shared pictures from their travels, their dinner parties with other successful couples. Their perfect life built on the foundation of cutting out the embarrassing relatives who might drag down their image. The obsession was unhealthy, I knew that. But it was also the only connection I had left to my daughter's life. I screenshotted their posts, studied them like archaeological evidence of the person she had become. I memorized the layout of their house from the background details in their photos. I could tell you the brand of their coffee maker, the titles of the books on their shelves, the names of their friends who commented on their adventures. It was during one of these late-night social media stalking sessions that I discovered David's secret. I was scrolling through Emma's Instagram when I noticed something in the background of a photo she had posted from their bedroom, a professional lighting setup that seemed out of place in what was supposed to be a private space. The caption was about a lazy Sunday morning, but the lighting suggested something more planned, more deliberate. I started paying closer attention to the details in their photos. David appeared less frequently in Emma's recent posts, and when he did, he looked tired, stressed in a way that didn't match the successful entrepreneur image he usually projected. There were hints, a phone left face down on their kitchen counter displaying a notification from an app one didn't recognize. A laptop open to what looked like a financial dashboard in the background of one of Emma's cooking videos. I'm not proud of what I did next. But desperation makes you resourceful in ways you never imagined. I hired a private investigator. Not someone expensive or sophisticated, I couldn't afford that, but a retired police detective who did background checks and insurance fraud cases. I told him I suspected David of having an affair, that I needed proof to protect my daughter's interests. It wasn't entirely a lie. I was protecting her interests, just not in the way she would have wanted. The investigator's name was Frank Morrison. And he had the tired eyes of someone who had seen too much of humanity's capacity for deception. He was thorough but discreet, the kind of man who understood that family secrets were often more explosive than criminal ones. Within 2 weeks, he had confirmed what I had begun to suspect. David wasn't having an affair in the traditional sense. But he was leading a double life that would destroy Emma's carefully constructed world if it became public knowledge. David had been creating content for adult subscription services under multiple usernames. Not just photos, but interactive video chats, custom content for high-paying subscribers, an entire online persona built around fulfilling fantasies for strangers on the internet. He had been doing it for almost 2 years, Frank discovered. Initially as a way to make extra money but eventually as a significant income stream that had helped fund their lifestyle upgrades. The details were more extensive than I had imagined. David had multiple accounts across different platforms, carefully managed to avoid detection. He had invested in professional photography equipment, created elaborate setups in their home, even rented hotel rooms for special content. His subscriber base was international, and he was earning more from his online activities than he made at his legitimate job. The Victorian house, the vacation home, the expensive cars, it was all built on money earned by selling intimate access to strangers. Frank provided me with screenshots, financial records, subscriber counts, and revenue estimates. David was making over $200,000 a year from his online activities, money he had hidden from Emma through a complex system of business accounts and cryptocurrency transactions. He had even incorporated himself as a digital marketing consultant, using that legitimate business as a front for his adult content empire. But the most damaging discovery was the evidence that Emma knew. Not everything, perhaps, but enough. There were text messages Frank had recovered from David's phone records showing conversations between them about photo shoots and content schedules. Emma had appeared in some of the background shots, though never explicitly. She had helped him set up the lighting, had been present during some of the filming. She was complicit, if not an active participant. Now, I need to pause here and ask you something. I know this story is taking you to some dark places, and I can see from the comments that you're all feeling the tension building. Before we get to what I did with this information, I want to know where you're watching from. Comment below and tell me your city and country. I love seeing how far these stories travel, how universal these family dramas really are. Are you watching from New York, London, Sydney? Let me know, and then buckle in because what comes next changed everything. I sat in my cramped apartment for 3 days, staring at Frank's report, trying to decide what to do with this nuclear weapon I now possessed. Richard was at work, unaware that I had just discovered the key to destroying the daughter who had destroyed us. The ethical part of my mind, the part that had once volunteered at children's hospitals and organized charity drives, screamed that this was wrong. That I was contemplating something unforgivable. But the wounded, bitter part of me, the part that had been growing stronger every day since Emma's rejection, whispered that this was justice. She had cut us off for the sake of her pristine reputation. She had chosen her perfect life over her family. She had made us invisible because we were an embarrassment. Now I had the power to make her understand what real embarrassment felt like. I didn't act immediately. I'm not impulsive by nature, and revenge is too important to rush. Instead, I spent weeks crafting a plan that would maximize damage while minimizing my exposure. I couldn't simply expose David's activities without destroying Emma in the process, which was, I'll admit, part of the appeal. But I also needed to protect myself legally and ensure that when the dust settled, I would be in a position to claim what I felt I deserved. My plan had 3 phases. First, I would use the information to force Emma into regular contact, to make her acknowledge us as family again. If she refused, I would escalate to phase 2, threatening public exposure unless she provided financial support to help Richard and me rebuild our lives. Phase 3, if necessary, would be total warfare, releasing everything to her law firm, her social media contacts, the local legal community, and anyone else who might find David's entrepreneurial activities interesting. I started with a simple phone call. When Emma answered, I could hear the barely concealed irritation in her voice. Hi, Mom. What do you need? Not, how are you? Or, I'm glad to hear from you. Just a weary acknowledgement that I probably wanted something from her. I think we need to have dinner, I said calmly. The 4 of us. It's been too long since we've all sat down together. Mom, I told you, I know what you told me, I interrupted. But circumstances have changed. I think David would agree that it's time for us to reconnect as a family. I let that hang in the air for a moment. Perhaps this Saturday? I could cook. Or we could go somewhere nice. David's treat, since business has been so good for him lately. There was a long pause. Emma was smart enough to recognize a threat when she heard one, even if she couldn't identify its exact nature. What are you talking about? I'm talking about family, Emma. About loyalty. About the obligations we have to each other. I kept my voice pleasant, conversational. I think David understands the importance of family more than you realize. I'd like the chance to discuss it with both of you. Another pause. I could practically hear her mind racing, trying to figure out what I knew and how much danger she was in. I'll need to check our schedule. Of course. But don't check too long. I'm very eager to see you both. And Emma? I think you'll find this conversation enlightening. They agreed to dinner at their house the following Saturday. I spent the week preparing, not just emotionally but practically. I printed out a carefully selected sample of Frank's evidence, enough to make my point without showing my entire hand. I practiced conversations in the mirror, working out how to present my demands without sounding like a blackmailer. Even though that's exactly what I had become, Richard knew something was happening but not what. I told him Emma had reached out, that she wanted to reconcile, that things were looking up for our family. He was pathetically grateful for even the possibility of reconnecting with our daughter. It broke my heart a little to see how much hope he invested in what he thought was Emma's change of heart. Saturday arrived gray and cold, which felt appropriate. Emma and David's Victorian house looked even more impressive in the winter light, its tall windows glowing warmly, smoke rising from the chimney like something from a Christmas card. I rang the doorbell carrying a bottle of wine and a manila envelope, symbols of celebration and destruction. Emma answered the door wearing a cashmere sweater and dark jeans, looking every inch the successful attorney she had become. She kissed my cheek dutifully and complimented the wine I had brought. David appeared moments later, and I studied his face carefully, looking for signs of guilt or awareness. He seemed nervous but genuinely pleased to see us, which made me wonder how much Emma had told him about my phone call. Dinner was awkward but not unusual by our family's recent standards. We made conversation about safe topics, the weather, Richard's new job, local news. Emma and David told us about their recent trip to Napa Valley, showing us photos on David's phone. I smiled and asked questions and pretended to be the loving mother-in-law I had once been. All while the manila envelope sat beside my purse like a loaded gun. After dinner, while Emma was clearing the table, I asked David if I could speak with him privately. Emma shot us both a sharp look but didn't object when David led me into his home office. The room was expensively decorated with built-in bookshelves and a massive desk that probably cost more than Richard and I spent on rent each month. But what caught my attention was the professional lighting equipment stored in one corner, partially covered by a sheet. David, I said, settling into one of his leather chairs, I want to talk to you about family loyalty. He looked confused, which was either genuine or expertly performed. Of course. I mean, I love Emma, and I want to have a good relationship with you and Richard. That's wonderful to hear. Because I've been wondering about your commitment to protecting this family's reputation. I opened the manila envelope and placed a single photograph on his desk, a screenshot from one of his premium subscription accounts. I imagine maintaining professional reputations is important to both you and Emma. The color drained from David's face so quickly I thought he might faint. He stared at the photograph, then at me, then back at the photograph. Where did you get this? David, I'm not here to judge you. We all do what we must to survive. But I am here to discuss what this information means for our family's future. I leaned forward slightly. You see, when Emma cut Richard and me out of your lives, she made a calculation about reputation and professional image. She decided we were a liability. Now I find myself in a position to make similar calculations. Emma doesn't know, he said quickly. I mean, she knows I do some freelance marketing work, but she doesn't know about this. I smiled, a cold expression I had learned from watching Richard navigate business negotiations. David, I have text messages between you two discussing content schedules and photo shoots. I have financial records showing money transfers from your business accounts to your personal accounts. I have evidence that Emma has been in your house during filming sessions. I paused. Emma is a lawyer. She's very good at knowing just enough to maintain plausible deniability while still being complicit. He slumped in his chair, looking like a man watching his entire world collapse in real time. Which, I suppose, he was. What do you want? I want my family back, David. I want regular dinners, holiday celebrations, birthdays acknowledged. I want to be included in your lives the way family should be. I placed another document on the desk, a bank statement showing his subscription revenue. And I think your recent financial success puts you in a position to help Richard and me rebuild our lives after the difficulties we faced. You're blackmailing me. I'm discussing family obligations. You've been very successful in your entrepreneurial ventures. Success brings responsibility. The responsibility to care for family members who have fallen on hard times. I stood up. I'll leave you to process this information. But David, I need you to understand something very clearly. I have copies of everything. Financial records, photographs, videos, subscriber lists, text messages. I have evidence that could destroy both your careers, your marriage, your social standing. I'm offering you a choice: embrace your family obligations voluntarily, or have them imposed on you in ways that will be much more painful for everyone. I left him sitting in his office, staring at the evidence of his secret life scattered across his expensive desk. Emma was waiting in the kitchen, washing dishes with the mechanical precision of someone trying to appear calm while their world shifts around them. David and I had a nice talk, I told her. About family. About responsibility. About the future. She didn't look at me, just continued washing the same plate over and over. What did you say to him? I told him how proud I am of both of you. How successful you've become. How much you've achieved. I picked up my purse and coat. I think we're going to be seeing much more of each other, Emma. David seemed very enthusiastic about strengthening our family bonds. Richard and I drove home in silence. He was happy, commenting on how nice it had been to spend time with Emma and David, how he thought they seemed more receptive to reconnecting. I let him believe it was genuine, that our daughter's heart had softened rather than her hand being forced. Sometimes protecting the people you love means letting them live with comfortable illusions, David called me the next morning. His voice was flat, defeated. What are your terms? I want monthly family dinners, alternating between your house and restaurants of your choosing. I want to be invited to significant events, anniversaries, birthdays, holidays. I want Emma to call me weekly, real conversations, not the perfunctory check-ins she used to give us. I paused. And I want financial assistance. Richard and I are starting over at 55. I think $50,000 would be a reasonable gesture of family support. To be paid over the course of a year, so it doesn't attract unwanted attention. $50,000? I don't have that kind of cash just sitting around. David, according to my information, you earn more than $200,000 a year from your online activities. $50,000 over 12 months is quite manageable. Consider it a family tax on your success. He was quiet for a long moment. Then, if we do this, you'll keep the information private? As long as everyone fulfills their family obligations, your privacy will be respected. But David, understand that this isn't a one-time payment for permanent silence. This is about rebuilding relationships, about maintaining ongoing family connections. The moment you or Emma decide to cut us out again, my discretion becomes negotiable. This is extortion. This is family. David. Welcome to how it really works. The monthly payments started the following week. Direct deposits from one of David's business accounts to my personal checking account, labeled as consulting fees. The family dinners resumed, stilted affairs where Emma and David performed warmth while Richard basked in what he thought was his daughter's genuine affection. I played the role of grateful mother, finally welcomed back into her child's life. While everyone at the table knew we were actors in a play none of us had auditioned for, Emma called me every Sunday evening. Conversations that lasted exactly long enough to meet the minimum requirement of our arrangement. We talked about safe topics, her work, my job at the home goods store, the weather. She never asked how I had discovered David's secret or what else I might know. She was too smart to ask questions she didn't want answered, but after 6 months, I could see the arrangement was eating away at all of us. David looked haggard during our family dinners, jumping every time his phone buzzed, constantly worried about maintaining his double life while funding his blackmailer. Emma had developed a nervous habit of checking her appearance in reflective surfaces, as if she was afraid someone was always watching, always documenting. Even Richard seemed to sense that something was wrong with our miraculous family reunion, though he couldn't identify what. I should have been satisfied. I had my daughter back, sort of. I had my revenge on the child who had abandoned us when things got difficult. I had enough money to help Richard and me rebuild our lives, to move into a better apartment, to start planning for a future that didn't feel like barely managed poverty. But satisfaction is not the same as happiness, and I was discovering that successful revenge can be its own form of prison. The arrangement might have continued indefinitely if not for David's mistake. During one of our monthly dinners, his phone rang and he stepped out to take the call. I excused myself to use the bathroom and followed him, listening from the hallway as he spoke to someone about scheduling a private session for the following evening. His voice had a warmth and enthusiasm that never appeared when he spoke to Emma or me. This was the voice of someone engaged in work he enjoyed. Talking to customers who valued what he offered. It occurred to me that I was forcing David to fund our family reconciliation with money he earned doing something that clearly brought him satisfaction, even pride. His online work wasn't just about money. It was about connection, creativity, building something of his own. And I was using it to destroy him, slowly and systematically, while pretending it was about family love. That night, lying in bed next to Richard, I finally understood what I had become. Not a mother fighting for her family's unity, but a predator feeding on her prey's shame and fear. I had taken David's secret life and transformed it into a weapon against my own daughter, forcing her to choose between her reputation and her mother's demands. I had created the very dynamic I claimed to oppose: conditional love. Family relationships based on coercion rather than genuine connection, but understanding what you've become and being able to stop being it are different things entirely. The money had become essential to our lifestyle. Richard had started talking about early retirement, about traveling, about possibilities he couldn't have imagined when we were selling furniture to pay legal bills. Emma's weekly phone calls had become a routine I depended on, even though I knew they were performances. David's monthly payments had given me a sense of power I had never experienced before, the ability to control other people's choices. To make them need something from me. I had become addicted to revenge, and like all addictions, it required increasingly larger doses to achieve the same satisfaction. The escalation began with a simple request for more money. I told David that Richard needed surgery, a lie, but a plausible one, and that insurance wouldn't cover all the costs. I needed an additional $20,000, paid immediately. David protested that he didn't have that kind of cash available, that his subscription income was seasonal and unpredictable. Then perhaps it's time to expand your business model, I suggested. I'm sure Emma would be happy to help with your marketing efforts. She's very photogenic, and couples content tends to perform better than solo work. The silence on the phone was so complete I thought the call had dropped. Then David said, very quietly, "You're asking me to involve Emma directly. I'm suggesting that family businesses often benefit from collaboration. Emma is beautiful, intelligent, and articulate. She could be an asset to your entrepreneurial activities." I let that sink in. Of course, if you prefer to find the money some other way, I'm open to alternatives. David found the money. I don't know how, whether he borrowed it, liquidated investments, or asked his subscribers for advance payments on content. But 3 days later, $20,000 appeared in my account, and David looked like a man who had sold something he couldn't afford to lose. The dynamic of our family dinners changed after that. Emma watched me with open suspicion, no longer pretending that our reconciliation was genuine. She had figured out that I was the source of whatever pressure David was under, even if she didn't know the exact nature of my leverage. During one dinner, she excused herself early, claiming a work emergency. As she gathered her purse and coat, she looked directly at me and said, "You know, Mom, I used to think Dad's legal troubles were the worst thing that could happen to our family. I was wrong." Richard, oblivious to the undercurrents, tried to smooth over the tension. "Emma's just stressed about work," he told me on the drive home. "She's been working too hard lately." But I knew better. Emma had recognized me as a threat to everything she had built. She was a lawyer. She understood coercion and leverage and the ways people could be manipulated through their vulnerabilities. She might not have known the specific details of my arrangement with David, but she understood that I was holding something over him, using it to force compliance with demands that were escalating beyond simple family reconciliation. The end came swiftly, the way these things often do. Emma hired her own private investigator, someone much more sophisticated than Frank Morrison, someone with resources and connections I couldn't match. Within 2 weeks, she had identified Frank, interviewed him about his work for me, and reconstructed my entire campaign against her husband. But she also discovered something I hadn't expected: David had been planning to confess everything to her for months. He had been seeing a therapist, working up the courage to come clean about his online activities and the blackmail arrangement. He had prepared a detailed plan for shutting down his subscription accounts, finding legitimate ways to replace that income, and rebuilding their marriage on a foundation of honesty rather than secrets. My blackmail hadn't just been destroying David. It had been preventing him from making the choice to be honest with his wife. I had trapped him in the very deception I was punishing him for, making it impossible for him to come clean without destroying everything. I had become the thing that stood between them and the authentic relationship they might have built. Emma confronted me on a Thursday evening in March. She appeared at my apartment without warning, carrying a manila envelope of her own. Richard was working late, so it was just the two of us, mother and daughter, locked in a battle that had been building for years before David's secret gave me the weapon I thought I needed. "I know what you've been doing," she said, settling into our cheap living room furniture like she was preparing for a deposition. "I know about David's online work. I know about Frank Morrison. I know about the payments, the threats, the escalating demands." I tried to maintain my composure, to project the same cold confidence I had used to control David for nearly a year. "Emma, I don't know what you think you've discovered, but, Mom, I'm a lawyer. I've spent the last 2 weeks building a case that could send you to prison for extortion, blackmail, and racketeering. I have financial records, recorded phone conversations, testimony from witnesses. She opened her envelope and spread documents across our coffee table. You've been operating a sophisticated blackmail scheme against your own son-in-law. You've extorted $70,000 from him in less than a year. You've threatened to destroy his reputation and mine unless we submitted to your demands for money and attention. Looking at the evidence she had assembled, I realized that Emma had inherited more from Richard than just his cold eyes. She had his ruthless precision, his ability to dissect a problem and identify its weaknesses. The case she had built against me was airtight, devastating. The kind of legal documentation that could destroy my life as completely as I had tried to destroy hers. But here's what I don't understand. Mom, she continued, her voice softening slightly. You already won. We were having monthly dinners. I was calling you every week. David was sending money that helped you and Dad rebuild your lives. You had everything you said you wanted. Why wasn't it enough? That was the question I couldn't answer, even to myself. Why hadn't it been enough to have my daughter's time and attention, even if I knew it was coerced? Why had I needed to escalate, to push harder, to demand more than simple compliance with my original terms? Why had successful revenge felt so much like failure? You cut us out, I said finally. When things got bad, when we needed you most, you made us invisible. You chose your reputation over your family. And you chose revenge over love, Emma replied. Even when you had me back in your life, it wasn't enough because you couldn't forgive me for the choice I made. You didn't want reconciliation, Mom. You wanted punishment. You wanted me to pay for hurting you, forever. She was right, and we both knew it. I had used David's secret not to rebuild our family but to create a new version of it where I held all the power, where Emma and David needed something from me that I could grant or withhold at will. I had replaced the love I thought I wanted with control I knew I could maintain. So here's what's going to happen, Emma said, gathering her documents. You're going to stop the blackmail immediately. You're going to return every dollar David paid you. You're going to destroy all the evidence you collected, and you're going to sign an agreement never to contact or threaten him again. And if I refuse? Then I file criminal charges tomorrow morning. I've already prepared the paperwork. David has agreed to cooperate fully with prosecution. Frank Morrison is willing to testify about the work he did for you. Emma stood up, smoothing her skirt. You'll go to prison, Mom. At 55, you'll spend the next decade of your life in a cell, thinking about how your need for revenge destroyed what was left of our family. I looked at my daughter, really looked at her, and saw someone I barely recognized. Not the child I had raised, not the young woman who had cut us out of her life, but a fully formed adult who had learned to protect herself and the people she loved with the same ruthless efficiency her father had once used in business. She had become someone capable of sending her own mother to prison if necessary to end a threat to her family's safety. There's a third option, Emma said quietly. You can disappear. Take Dad and move somewhere far away. Start over completely, with the understanding that if you ever contact us again, if you ever threaten David or attempt to interfere in our lives, I will pursue criminal charges regardless of how much time has passed. I stared at her, this stranger who shared my DNA but not my capacity for forgiveness. You would really send me to prison? Your own mother? You would really blackmail your own daughter's husband? Extort money from your own family? Force us to perform love we didn't feel while you held our lives hostage? Emma's voice was steady, but I could see tears forming in her eyes. Yes, Mom. I would send you to prison. Because what you've done isn't love. It's not even revenge. It's cruelty, pure and simple, and I won't let you hurt the people I care about anymore. I had a choice to make, and we both knew I would choose survival over pride. I signed Emma's agreement that night, promising to cease all contact with David, to return the money I had extorted, to destroy the evidence I had collected. I agreed to leave the state within 60 days and never return. I agreed to become invisible. Again, but this time by my own choice rather than Emma's rejection. Richard took the news about our sudden relocation surprisingly well. I told him I had been offered a job opportunity in Arizona, managing a boutique hotel's interior design needs. It wasn't entirely a lie, I had found such a position through online applications, though the salary was modest and the work was far from glamorous. Richard was ready for a fresh start, somewhere his reputation hadn't been tainted by scandal, somewhere he could rebuild his consulting practice with clients who had never heard his name. We left Pennsylvania on a Tuesday morning in May, driving west in a rented truck loaded with our modest possessions. I had returned $68,000 to David, every payment except the final $20,000, which I kept to fund our relocation and help us establish a new life. It was a small act of defiance, my way of ensuring that my surrender wasn't complete. Emma knew about the shortfall but chose not to pursue it, perhaps recognizing that I needed something to maintain my dignity during the retreat. The hotel job in Arizona was exactly as mundane as I had expected. I spent my days selecting bedspreads and coordinating paint colors, creating pleasant but forgettable spaces for travelers who would never remember their stay. Richard found work with a small pharmaceutical consulting firm that specialized in generic drug development. Our new life was quiet, anonymous, the kind of existence we might have chosen if we had ever learned to be content with modest success. But the silence between us grew deeper each month. Richard never asked why we had really left Pennsylvania, but he stopped believing my story about the job opportunity. He noticed that I never spoke to Emma anymore, that our daughter's weekly phone calls had ceased as abruptly as they had resumed. He saw the way I flinched when Arizona newspapers mentioned stories about Pennsylvania, as if I was afraid of being discovered by people who had forgotten we existed. The truth was that I missed my daughter desperately, but it was a different kind of missing than before. I no longer missed the relationship we had lost. I mourned the relationship we might have built if I had chosen reconciliation over revenge. During my months of blackmailing David, I had glimpsed moments of genuine connection with Emma, brief conversations where she let her guard down, times when she seemed to remember that she had once loved me unconditionally. But instead of nurturing those moments, I had weaponized them, using her vulnerability to increase my leverage over her life. I found out about Emma's pregnancy through social media, the way strangers learn about each other's lives. David posted a photo of ultrasound images with a caption about their excitement for the journey ahead. Emma shared the announcement on her professional accounts, surrounded by congratulations from colleagues and friends. I stared at the images on my phone, realizing that I would never meet my grandchild, that my actions had made me toxic to the next generation of our family before they were even born. Richard saw the posts too. I found him sitting in our cramped Arizona apartment, holding his laptop and crying quietly. "We're going to be grandparents," he said, looking at me with the confused grief of someone who couldn't understand why joy felt like loss. "Emma's having a baby, and we'll never know them." I couldn't explain to Richard that our exile wasn't punishment for his legal troubles or Emma's earlier rejection. It was the consequence of my choice to value control over connection, revenge over repair. I had burned down the bridge I was trying to rebuild, and now we were all stranded on opposite sides of the wreckage. The baby was born on October morning, Emma Grace Morrison, named for her mother and carrying David's surname. I learned this from Facebook, from photos of a tiny face surrounded by hospital blankets. David's caption talked about falling in love at first sight, about promises to be the father his daughter deserved. Emma posted about the overwhelming joy of motherhood, about feeling complete in ways she had never imagined. I created a fake social media account to follow their updates, becoming a digital ghost haunting my own family's happiness. I watched my granddaughter's first smiles, her first attempts to sit up, her first Christmas morning surrounded by presents and grandparents who weren't me. David's parents were constant presences in the photos, helping with feedings, reading bedtime stories, playing on living room floors. They had become the family I had forfeited through my choices. Richard's health began declining during our second year in Arizona. Nothing dramatic at first, just increased fatigue, occasional confusion, moments when he seemed to forget where we were or why we had moved. The doctors diagnosed early-stage dementia, likely accelerated by the stress of our financial collapse and social exile. As his condition progressed, he began asking about Emma more frequently, wondering why she never called, why we never visited our granddaughter. I spent increasing amounts of time managing Richard's care while maintaining my job at the hotel. The work became a refuge from the guilt that consumed our apartment, from Richard's innocent questions about our family, from the knowledge that his remaining lucid years would be spent in confused grief over relationships he didn't understand had been destroyed. During Richard's clearer moments, he would ask direct questions I couldn't answer honestly. "What happened with Emma?" he would say. "What did we do that was so terrible she can't forgive us?" I would deflect, change the subject, pretend his medication was making him paranoid. But I could see in his eyes that he knew I was lying, that something catastrophic had occurred beyond Emma's earlier rejection. Emma's daughter began walking early, according to the social media updates I consumed like a stalker. Photos showed her taking tentative steps between David and Emma in their living room, the same room where I had once sat plotting my revenge against the man who was now teaching my granddaughter to dance to children's music. Emma posted videos of bedtime stories, of first words, of a child growing up surrounded by love and stability while her biological grandmother watched from across the country like a voyeur. The hardest part wasn't the isolation itself but the knowledge that it was self-imposed. Emma hadn't cut me out of her life this time. I had chosen exile to avoid prison. She hadn't rejected me. I had made myself too dangerous to be around. Every holiday, every birthday, every milestone I missed was the direct consequence of my decision to prioritize revenge over redemption. 3 years after leaving Pennsylvania, I received a letter forwarded from our old address. Emma's handwriting on the envelope made my hands shake as I opened it. Inside was a single photograph, my granddaughter on her second birthday, chocolate cake smeared across her face, surrounded by family members I didn't recognize. On the back, Emma had written, "Her name is Grace. She asks about grandparents sometimes. I tell her they live far away. No return address. No invitation for contact. Just acknowledgement that my granddaughter existed, that she was growing up knowing she had family she would never meet." It was Emma's way of letting me know that my exile had consequences beyond my own. Loneliness, that my choices had created holes in an innocent child's life that could never be filled. I carried that photograph everywhere, showing it to no one but taking it out during break times at work, studying my granddaughter's face for resemblances to Emma at that age. Grace had Richard's eyes and Emma's smile, David's dark hair and what looked like my stubborn chin. She was beautiful and happy and completely unaware that her paternal grandfather was dying slowly in Arizona while her maternal grandmother managed hotel room redesigns to pay for his care. Richard's condition deteriorated steadily. By his 4th year in Arizona, he required constant supervision, help with basic tasks, reminders about where he was and who I was. The man who had once commanded boardrooms and intimidated opposing counsel now needed assistance remembering how to use a fork. I became his caregiver, his memory, his connection to a world that made less sense to him each day, but even in his confusion, Richard remembered Emma. He would ask for her constantly, wondering when she was coming to visit, why she hadn't called in so long. During his worst episodes, he would insist that Emma was supposed to pick him up for dinner, that she was expecting us at her house for holiday celebrations that existed only in his deteriorating mind. I would play along, telling him Emma was running late, that she would call later, that we would see her soon. The lies I told Richard were kinder than the truth. But they tortured me with visions of the life we might have lived if I had chosen differently. In his dementia-addled imagination, Emma was still our loving daughter, eager to spend time with her parents, excited to share her child's milestones with her grandparents. His confused memories were more beautiful than our actual history. And I began to understand that his illness was offering him a gift I couldn't access, the ability to forget the pain we had inflicted on each other. Richard died on a Wednesday morning in December, 5 years after we had fled Pennsylvania. I was holding his hand when he passed, and his last words were, "Tell Emma I love her." I promised I would, knowing it was another lie in a life that had become defined by deception. There was no way to contact Emma without violating our agreement. No way to inform her that her father had died thinking about her, missing her, loving her despite everything that had transpired. I arranged a simple funeral service with no attendees except myself and the hotel manager who had become the closest thing I had to a friend. Richard was cremated, his ashes stored in an urn I kept on our apartment's mantel. I had thought about scattering them somewhere meaningful, but there was nowhere left that felt connected to the life we had built together. Pennsylvania was forbidden territory. Arizona was just where we had waited to die. After Richard's death, the silence in our apartment became unbearable. I had grown accustomed to his questions about Emma, his confused requests to call our daughter, his innocent assumption that families stayed together through difficult times. Without his voice, I was left alone with the reality of what I had done. With the knowledge that I had destroyed my family's future to satisfy my need for revenge against their past, I began drinking more than I should have. Spending evenings with cheap wine and social media stalking. Watching my granddaughter grow up through carefully curated posts that revealed just enough to torture me with what I was missing. Grace was 4 now, articulate and curious, asking questions about the world that David and Emma answered with patience and humor. She was starting pre-kindergarten, learning to ride a bicycle, developing preferences for books and toys and foods that I would never influence. Emma had returned to work part-time after Grace's birth, specializing in family law, a choice that felt like cosmic irony. She was helping other families navigate divorce, custody disputes, adoption procedures, all the legal mechanisms that governed love and responsibility and obligation. Her professional website included a photo of her with Grace, both of them smiling in front of their Victorian house. The bio mentioned her commitment to protecting children's interests in family conflicts. Her belief that legal systems should prioritize healing over punishment. Reading about Emma's career made me wonder if she had chosen family law because of our situation. If helping other families repair their relationships was her way of processing the irreparable damage I had done to ours. Or perhaps she was trying to understand the legal and emotional mechanisms that had allowed me to weaponize family connections, to transform love into leverage and loyalty into extortion. 6 months after Richard's death, I made a decision that felt both inevitable and impossible. I wrote Emma a letter, not seeking reconciliation or forgiveness, but simply to inform her that Richard had passed away, that his last thoughts had been of her, that whatever mistakes we had made as parents, his love for her had remained constant until the end. I didn't mail the letter immediately. Instead, I carried it with me for weeks, revising it constantly, trying to find words that could communicate grief without manipulation. information without hidden demands. I wanted Emma to know about her father's death, but I also wanted her to understand that I wasn't using his passing as leverage for renewed contact. This was closure, not opening a new chapter in our relationship. The final version of the letter was brief, factual, and final. I told Emma that Richard had died peacefully, that he had spoken of her often during his illness, that he had loved her unconditionally despite our family's fractures. I included information about his cremation, in case she wanted to arrange for a memorial service or burial in Pennsylvania. I provided my address and phone number but explicitly stated that I wasn't requesting any response or contact. I was simply fulfilling a duty to inform her of her father's passing, honoring what I owed to Richard's memory rather than pursuing what I wanted for myself. I mailed the letter on a Thursday afternoon and immediately regretted it. Not because I hadn't wanted Emma to know about Richard's death, but because sending it felt like breaking the terms of our agreement, like reaching across the boundary I had promised to maintain. Even with the best intentions, I was still finding ways to insert myself into my daughter's life when she had made it clear that my presence was unwelcome. Emma's response arrived 3 weeks later, a single page that managed to be both generous and devastating. She thanked me for informing her about Richard's death, expressed genuine grief for the father she had lost, and provided information about a memorial service she had arranged at his favorite restaurant in Pennsylvania. She also made it clear that this exchange was an exception to our permanent separation, not the beginning of renewed contact. But the most painful part of her letter was a single paragraph about Grace. "She's been asking more questions about grandparents lately," Emma wrote. "Other children at school talk about their grandparents, and she wants to understand why hers aren't part of her life. I've told her that sometimes families live far apart, that distance doesn't mean lack of love. I think she deserves to know that her grandfather loved her, even though they never met. But I also think she deserves to grow up without the complications that have defined our family's history." Emma was protecting Grace from me, and she was right to do so. I had proven myself capable of using family connections as weapons, of transforming love into leverage when my needs weren't being met. Grace deserved grandparents who could love her unconditionally, without hidden agendas or unresolved grievances. She deserved family relationships based on joy rather than obligation, connection rather than coercion. I didn't attend Richard's memorial service, though Emma had included details about the time and location. Pennsylvania was still forbidden territory, and showing up would have violated the agreement that had kept me out of prison. But I spent that day thinking about the service, imagining Emma surrounded by friends and colleagues who had known Richard during his successful years, who remembered him as the accomplished businessman rather than the broken man who had died confused and exiled in Arizona. The answer, I think, is yes. There were countless moments when I could have chosen differently, countless opportunities to prioritize love over pride, reconciliation over revenge. But I was too wounded, too angry, too convinced that Emma owed me something she wasn't willing to give freely. I transformed my legitimate hurt into illegitimate weapons, and I destroyed the very relationships I was trying to repair. The irony is that my blackmail scheme succeeded beyond my wildest expectations. I got exactly what I demanded: regular contact with Emma, weekly phone calls, monthly family dinners, financial support for our new life. But because I had coerced these gestures rather than earning them, they felt hollow even as they were happening. I had won the war and lost everything that had made victory worth pursuing. This is what revenge really costs. Not just the relationships you destroy in pursuit of satisfaction, but the capacity for authentic connection that gets corrupted by the desire for control. I spent so much energy trying to force Emma to love me that I forgot how to love her freely, how to accept her limitations while still maintaining my own dignity. I became addicted to the power of making her need something from me. And that addiction destroyed any possibility of genuine reconciliation. If I could send one message to my daughter now, it wouldn't be an apology, though I am sorry, more sorry than words can express. It would be a promise that her children are safe from me, that I will never again use family connections as weapons, that my exile will remain voluntary and permanent. Emma deserves to raise her children without fear that their grandmother might reappear with new demands or hidden agendas. Grace and David Richard deserve grandparents who can love them unconditionally. And that's not something I've proven capable of providing. My love has too many conditions, too many requirements, too much need for control and validation. They're better off with David's parents, who offer affection without strings, who can be present for school plays and birthday parties without carrying decades of unresolved grievances. The hardest part isn't losing my family, but accepting that losing them was the right outcome. Emma made the difficult but correct choice to prioritize her children's safety over her mother's feelings. David found the courage to build an honest marriage despite my attempts to trap him in permanent deception. Grace and David Richard are growing up in a family defined by love rather than leverage. Connection rather than coercion. My story is a cautionary tale about the seductive power of revenge and the devastating cost of using family relationships as weapons. I won every battle I chose to fight, but the victory destroyed everything I had been fighting to preserve. I got my daughter's attention, her time, her husband's money. But I lost their love, their trust, their desire to have me in their lives voluntarily. As this tale comes to its end, I want you to remember that some wounds can't be healed by inflicting new ones. Some rejections can't be reversed through manipulation and force. Some love can't be coerced back into existence once it's been damaged by betrayal and deception. Revenge may feel like justice, but it's really just another form of destruction that spreads until it consumes everything you were trying to protect. I hope Emma and David are happy. I hope Grace and David Richard grow up surrounded by the kind of unconditional love I was never able to provide. I hope they never learn about the grandmother who loved them so poorly that she had to disappear to keep them safe. And I hope that somewhere, in whatever way makes sense to her, Emma has found peace with the choices she made to protect her family from mine. That's my story, a story of revenge that succeeded completely and failed catastrophically. A story of winning everything I thought I wanted and losing everything that actually mattered. Take from it what you will, but remember this: family isn't about power or control or getting what you think you're owed. It's about love without conditions, support without strings, presence without agendas. I forgot that truth, and it cost me everything. If this story has moved you, if it's made you think about your own family relationships and the choices you make when you're hurt or angry, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. These stories matter because they remind us of what we can lose when we let revenge replace love, when we choose control over connection. Thank you for listening to my confession, my warning, my final gift to strangers who might learn from my mistakes what I couldn't learn in time to save my family. The memorial service was covered by a local newspaper, which posted photos online. Emma looked beautiful in her black dress, holding Grace's hand while David carried their son, a baby I hadn't known existed until I saw him in the photographs. My family had grown while I was in exile, new life joining the world while I was banned from witnessing it. Grace had a little brother who would grow up never knowing he had grandparents on his mother's side, never understanding why his family tree had deliberate gaps where love should have flourished. Seeing photos of Emma's son, David Richard Morrison, named for both his grandfathers, broke something inside me that I hadn't realized was still intact. This child would carry Richard's name but not his memory, would honor a man he would never meet because his grandmother had chosen revenge over relationship. David Richard would grow up hearing stories about the grandfather he was named for. But those stories would be sanitized versions that omitted the context of our family's destruction. I realized then that my punishment wasn't exile from my family's present but exclusion from their future. Emma's children would inherit narratives about their maternal grandparents that portrayed us as tragic figures who had died or disappeared, rather than as people who had chosen destruction over reconciliation. Grace and David Richard would never know that their grandmother was alive, working in hotel management in Arizona, spending her evenings drinking wine and scrolling through photos of their childhood milestones like a digital voyeur. The isolation became unbearable after seeing photos of Richard's memorial service. I had thought exile was my punishment, but I was beginning to understand that loneliness was just the beginning of consequences that would compound for the rest of my life. Every birthday, every Christmas, every milestone I missed was interest accumulating on the debt I owed for choosing revenge over repair. My grandchildren would grow up, graduate from school, get married, have children of their own. All while I watched from afar or not at all. 7 years after leaving Pennsylvania, I was diagnosed with breast cancer. The irony wasn't lost on me, dying slowly from a disease that attacks the organs symbolically associated with maternal nurturing. The treatment was aggressive but effective, leaving me weak and nauseated but ultimately cancer-free. Throughout months of chemotherapy and radiation, I had no family members to drive me to appointments, to sit with me during infusions, to celebrate when my oncologist declared me in remission. I thought about contacting Emma during my treatment. Not to seek sympathy but to provide practical information about family medical history that might be relevant to her children's future health. But even cancer couldn't justify breaking our agreement, and I couldn't risk using my illness as emotional manipulation the way I had used David's secret as financial leverage. Emma deserved to live her life without wondering when the next crisis would bring me back into her orbit. Instead, I managed my cancer treatment alone, driving myself to appointments when possible, relying on hospital social workers and volunteer programs when I was too weak to function independently. The experience taught me something about resilience I hadn't expected, that survival was possible even without family support, that people could endure extraordinary hardship with only professional caregivers and casual friendships to sustain them, but surviving alone also clarified what I had lost through my choices. During my worst moments, vomiting from chemotherapy, lying awake at night wondering if the cancer would return, Facing the possibility of dying in Arizona with no one to claim my body, I understood that family isn't just about love or even obligation. It's about witnessing, about having people who remember your life even after you're gone, who carry forward stories about who you were and what you meant to them. Emma's children would grow up without those stories about me. They would never know that their grandmother had once been good at organizing charity events, that she had made elaborate Halloween costumes by hand, that she had spent hours helping with homework and science projects. They would never hear about the woman I had been before I became the woman who had threatened their father and traumatized their mother. My grandchildren would inherit a family history with a deliberate gap where I should have been. And that erasure was exactly what I had earned through my actions. Recovery from cancer left me physically weaker but emotionally clearer about the time I had remaining. I was 62, likely to live another 20 years if the cancer didn't return, facing 2 decades of exile from the people I loved most. The hotel management job had become routine, even pleasant. I had developed genuine friendships with some colleagues, found satisfaction in creating welcoming spaces for travelers, built a modest life that met my basic needs for security and purpose, but I also began planning for my death. Not because I was suicidal but because I wanted to ensure that my final act toward my family would be different from everything that had preceded it. I updated my will to leave my modest savings to educational accounts for Grace and David Richard, money they could access for college expenses without knowing its source. I wrote letters to each of my grandchildren, to be delivered when they turned 18, explaining who I had been and what I had done without seeking forgiveness or contact. The letters were the hardest thing I had ever written. Attempts to introduce myself to children who would be adults before they knew I had existed. I wanted Grace and David Richard to understand that their maternal grandmother had loved them from a distance, that my absence from their lives had been self-imposed rather than evidence of indifference. I wanted them to know that Richard had died loving them, talking about them, hoping to meet them someday, but I also wanted them to understand why Emma had made the choices she had made, why protecting them from me had been an act of love rather than cruelty. I tried to explain the blackmail, the extortion, the revenge that had poisoned our family's relationships without making excuses for my behavior. I wanted my grandchildren to understand their families' history while also recognizing that some patterns of behavior should never be repeated. Writing those letters forced me to confront the full scope of what I had done to my family. Not just the blackmail and extortion, but the deeper betrayal of using David's vulnerability to punish Emma for choices she had made during her own family's crisis. I had taken a secret that could have brought them closer together, David's eventual confession, Emma's opportunity to forgive and rebuild, and transformed it into a weapon that destroyed any possibility of authentic reconciliation. The tragedy wasn't just that I had lost my family, but that I had prevented them from becoming the family they might have been. David's honesty about his online work could have been a catalyst for deeper intimacy in their marriage. Emma's forgiveness could have strengthened their relationship while teaching Grace and David Richard about compassion and second chances. Instead, my intervention had frozen them in patterns of secrecy and fear that might persist long after I was gone. Now, as I sit in my Arizona apartment 9 years after leaving Pennsylvania, I understand that my story doesn't have a redemptive ending. There will be no reunion, no forgiveness, no grandmotherly moments with children who don't know I exist. Emma was right to cut me out of their lives, and I was right to accept exile rather than prison. But understanding the necessity of our separation doesn't make it less painful or more meaningful. Emma's children are growing up beautiful and loved, surrounded by family members who can offer them unconditional affection without hidden agendas. Grace is 9 now, probably playing sports or learning instruments, developing interests and talents I will never know about. David Richard is 6, starting school, making friends, becoming a person whose personality I can only imagine through carefully cropped social media posts. Sometimes I wonder if Emma ever thinks about me, whether she feels any sadness about our permanent separation or only relief that the threat I represented has been neutralized. I wonder if she's ever tempted to show Grace and David Richard photos of the grandmother they'll never know, or if she's completely erased me from their family narrative. I wonder if David ever feels guilty about the money he paid to keep his secret safe, or if he's grateful that my blackmail forced him to confront issues he might have avoided indefinitely. But mostly, I wonder if there was ever a path that could have led us back to each other without the destruction I caused. Could I have responded to Emma's initial rejection with patience rather than revenge? Could I have found ways to rebuild our relationship without using David's secret as leverage? Could I have chosen healing over destruction, connection over control?